All right. Well, thank you, Dominic. It's lovely to see all of your smiling faces so early this morning. Glad you could all make it and decided to spend the last or these 2 days with us. I'm excited personally for this panel, especially following the debate this week, which was something. And so we're going to kind of talk about some of those things that were brought up in the debate, but also things that have been floating around in the ether as we approach the election. And the title is really kind of getting at the idea of, we talk about these economic policies, the differences and what the economy will look like, and really kind of parse out, well, what are those differences and are they really all that different, especially since the economy tends to be one of the top things, if not the top thing, that voters are concerned about in this upcoming election. And so I'm going to start off first with you, Alex, talking a little bit about tax policy. So taxes obviously came up during the debate. Vice President Harris accused President Trump of tax cuts for billionaires. Instead, she proposed tax cuts for the middle class, including a child tax credit. First, can you just kind of explain what the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act actually was that President Trump was over and its actual effects? And then can you give us a kind of a rundown of the likely outcomes of a Harris president's tax cuts and the child tax credit and so forth?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. Thanks everyone for taking your Fridays and spending it with us. So in 2017, Congress enacted a fairly large and significant tax policy, a tax reform, this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, sometimes referred to as the Trump tax cuts. This was a partisan effort. Only Republican votes brought that bill to the president's desk. That bill was years in the making, long before President Trump was running for presidency. House Republicans were working on a tax reform bill. So this is very much kind of came out of the House Republican side, where the elements of that bill sort of in two parts. One is a set of corporate reforms where the corporate tax rate came way down from 35% to 21%, and a whole host of other international tax reforms. And then a set of reforms on the individual income tax side where the child tax credit was increased, the standard deduction was increased, marginal tax rates came down a little bit, and there were some other base broadeners and limitations. And the one that's sort of most discussed is something called SALT cap, which limits your ability to deduct your state and local taxes on your federal tax return. All these reforms taken together constitute this TCJA bill. And those reforms on the individual side are temporary. They're set to expire at the end of next year. So we are headed into a period of time where tax policy is sort of ratcheting up on the policy agenda. There will be some need for Congress to wrestle with the pending expiration of these tax cuts. Former President Trump has talked about extending all of them. The Biden administration and candidate Harris have talked about extending most of them, but not those provisions that benefit high-income individuals. And so this question of what to do is a multi-trillion-dollar question. So in the event that they do nothing, which is very unlikely, revenues will be roughly $3 to $4 trillion higher over the next decade than in the scenario where they choose to keep all of these provisions and extend them for the coming decade. So there's a large fiscal question here that will be wrestled with in 2025, regardless who's in the White House. In addition to that, candidates are suggesting additional tax cuts. And so Vice President Harris has talked about expanding the child tax credit from $2,000 to generally $3,000, sometimes $3,600, sometimes $6,000, depending on the age of the child. J.D. Vance has talked about a $5,000 child tax credit. Both candidates have talked about not taxing tips that you earn as a waiter or waitress or in other professions. Yesterday, former President Trump was talking about no tax on overtime income. So all of those policies are also expensive and would add hundreds, if not trillions of dollars to the deficit as well. And so those are some of the I forget the question here, but that's some of the lay of the ground, like the groundwork of what's in play and the relative cost of those policies.
No,
I've got one
go for
big
it.
tax policy. Maybe we don't usually think about it as tax policy as much, but of course, a big revenue raiser for the Trump campaign is to impose tariffs on imports from all around the world. Well, that's tax revenue.
Absolutely.
So
yeah. Yeah, and in sort of very rough math to think about that, I mean, we don't know exactly what the tariff policy would be if former President Trump were to return to the White House, but people who have listened closely to that rhetoric and thought about what kind of revenue might be generated is it's also trillions of dollars. So one could imagine, and I think this is what Vice President Harris was referring to, is if those tariff policies came into effect, there'd be perhaps $3 trillion in additional tariff revenue that comes in. That would offset the cost of extending, again, rough math here, offset the cost of much of extending those tax cuts. So in that sense, those tariffs are tax increases borne in large part by ordinary Americans, middle-class Americans, in exchange for the lower income tax rates.
So since you brought up tariffs, Stan, one of the things that came up in the debate was obviously former President Trump basically saying, I'm going to tariff even harder. And Vice President Harris kind of avoided the fact that the Biden administration has largely kept Trump's tariffs and in some ways expanded it. And so what does this mean for global trade under Trump or under Harris? Is it going to look very similar? And also, one of the things that former President Trump said was that we took in billions from China and all this type of stuff. But is that really true, or has the bill been footed by American consumers?
So let me first take that last question.
Sure.
So I mean, it's definitely true that imposing tariffs on imports brings you tax revenue, right? Just like taxing other activity brings you tax revenue. What's not the case is that it's not the Chinese government does not write a check to the U.S. government, right? The burden of the tax is ultimately on consumers or producers in China or the U.S. or third countries, depending on how the supply chains run. I think most studies of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed suggest that most of the incidence was on U.S. consumers, and so I think the way to think of it is the way we think of other domestic taxes, which is the consumers, U.S. residents, pay taxes to the U.S. federal government. But it does bring in revenue. That's really true. And as Alex pointed out, and I think doing the revenue forecasts for the kind of scale of tariffs that Trump has proposed now is quite difficult because they're so far out of the range of what we've seen in recent years. Is difficult, but they definitely bring in significant revenue, as we've seen in the experience of the past few years. Now, going forward, I think with a Harris administration, what you would see would look quite similar to the status quo we have now, right? With more tariffs, higher trade barriers to trade, more export controls than we saw 10 years ago, and no ambition to strike new free trade agreements. Some rhetoric about friendshoring and about an alliance of sort of free economies against China, but really no follow through on that, and using that sort of as cover to continue to impose protectionist measures against China and other countries that are seen as not playing by the rules. I think under a Trump administration, you would see a much further escalation of protectionist policy, right? I don't think we would end up in an equilibrium where you have a 60% tariff on Chinese imports and a 10% or 20% tariff on all other imports, but you would have a starting position along those lines, right? In the first year of the Trump administration, you would see them impose tariffs on, I think, a lot of trading partners, but the European Union would retaliate, Japan would retaliate. Those are big economies that the U.S. Trades with significantly, and there would be significant domestic political pressure on the Trump administration to strike agreements with those countries to reach agreements to remove those tariffs. And so I would imagine that we would end up in a situation where after a lot of chaos and negotiating, we'd basically end up in the status quo in North America with USMCA or something like that with respect to the European Union, UK, and Japan, with much higher tariffs imposed on China, and then the rest of the world doesn't really matter for U.S. trade purposes, right? It's the there are free trade agreements with many countries in Central America and South America that I assume we would keep in place, especially a Trump administration, because it'll be very reliant on those countries to help with immigration policy objectives. And then what's left is the minimum, right? India is there, but it's not that large a trading partner as you might expect. Anyway, so I do think there's a clear divergence there, right? You keep basically the status quo with Harris administration, maybe more export restrictions on certain technologies toward China, maybe a little more industrial policy at home. With a Trump administration, I think you'd see quite a bit of chaos and significant additional protectionist measures, especially toward China. But a lot of chaos in the process, and certainly temporary additional restrictions even toward our closest allies, and certainly a lot of uncertainty for businesses involved in trade, even with Canada, Mexico, European Union, UK, Japan.
Well, with that, you brought up, I'll stick with you, Stan. I'd like to get Jim and Alex on this as well. But you brought up immigration, and former or Vice President Harris's future border policy is kind of hard to pin down. Her previous border policy is also hard to pin down, whether she was or wasn't a border czar, all that type of stuff. What does immigration look like under a Trump administration versus a Harris administration, and what are the economic pros and cons of greater or less immigration? Are there fewer jobs to go around? Are there fewer pets to go around?
So let's do it first. So on the border, I don't think a Harris administration would look very different from what we have right now certainly in the first years, right? With much more restrictive rules for applying for asylum, for example. I don't think we'd go back to the regime that was in place 2 years ago. I don't think we would go all the way back to the COVID regime, where there was really significant tightening of the ability to apply for asylum. I think a Trump administration would basically want to go back to that regime, right, where you come up with some national security or public health rationale to basically shut down the border and abolish the asylum regime. And I assume that courts would go along with that, because if you say the magical word national security, the Supreme Court usually signs off on your policies. So that's on the border. I think more broadly on that, of course, first that doesn't mean that border crossings will end, because that's not how prohibition works. Then more broadly on legal immigration, there are very large differences between the two parties, between the two campaigns. And there, I think you would just see pretty dramatic differences in the number of people that would come into the country, and really just in the size of the labor force almost. You can go through a number of pretty significant programs that a Trump administration would shut down or basically or reduce in size by 90%. That you can think of the humanitarian parole program for Ukrainians, the humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans. That alone is about 400,000 people a year, right? So over a 4-year period, that's almost 2 million people who are legally admitted. The refugee resettlement program now admits over 100,000 people a year. Under Trump, that would go down to basically zero, I think. And so that's another 500,000 people. Right? So you really, the difference just in the number of people admitted would enter the millions quite quickly. And I think under Trump administration, basically every immigration category that does not involve, directly bribing a senior member of the executive branch would, I think, be restricted pretty significantly. And so that has a range of implications. I mean, the first one is just, your aggregate output, right? And so to the extent that we have, for example, overhanging debt from the past, that's going to have to be paid off by fewer people if you have a smaller population. If the provision of certain public goods, like the military, national security apparatus, that's easier if you're a bigger country, right? And so for certain functions of the federal government, it's just helpful to be larger, right? If you have to pay off debt you accumulated in the past, or if you have to build aircraft carriers, you want to have more people. So that's one effect. Then secondly, to the extent that you're concerned about tight labor markets, inflationary pressures that come from there, letting fewer workers in at all skill levels will be a cause for concern there. I think one area that many economists are particularly concerned about is immigration more into high-skilled categories. And I think there, the Trump administration is also going to make immigration sort of harder at every step, right? Like do away with interview waivers, make labor certifications more costly, raise visa fees at every step. Really just every lever they can pull at DHS, at the Labor Department, I think they will pull. And so you'll just see numbers go down across the spectrum. They'll have implications for the U.S.'s ability to innovate, for new businesses to get started by immigrants, for universities to be able to attract talent. I think economically it's quite negative. If you want to see a positive, I think especially low-skilled immigrants have a pretty negative fiscal impact on local governments in particular, and so there will be some burden, will be relief there. Some housing markets are super supply constrained in the U.S., and so to the extent that fewer people come into the country, it puts downward pressure on housing prices there, which obviously lowers people's cost of living. I would prefer to loosen the supply constraints on those housing markets, but I think those are two positives that you can genuinely point to. Then on the pets, I do think it's kind of remarkable how the rhetoric has shifted. This kind of sort of openly racist, the Haitians are going to eat your cats, like that. Laura Loomer being a prominent advisor to a GOP presidential candidate, that would not have flown 10 years ago. Yeah. And you see individual people go through this transformation, right? Like Ted Cruz was on the floor of the Republican convention in 2016 screaming for people to vote their principal or whatever. Now, I don't typically have a very high, level of confidence in the sincerity of politicians when they proclaim their principle or their sincerity of their religious convictions, but it's still pretty remarkable to see him or Mike Lee evolve as they have. Someone who, of course, has had a lot of foresight in this area is the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party, who wrote a book about how it's very easy to appeal to people in Ohio, Pennsylvania, by appealing to their sort of lowest instincts. He used to pretend that was a bad thing. Now he pretends it's a good thing. But, I think he's understood the situation all along.
Yeah.
I mean, Dr. Voiger,
Yeah.
because you avoided answering it. Are you for or against voodoo rituals? Just answer the question. Answer the question. Don't wait for the translation. Answer the question.
I don't think I would separate legitimate voodoo rituals from just eating for fun.
That's.
Jim has a
I
whole.
think that's fair. I think that's a fair response.
Yeah, Jim has a whole classification of animals that he thinks are too smart to eat. That's the only criterion he cares about. It's not cuteness or size. It's pure IQ score. If you're above the.
I'm not alone in this. I don't think I'm alone in that.
Isn't that the rule? Like pigs are too smart?
I'm not sure what the rule is.
Okay, well, all right. Anyway, I'm just going to cut that off now. Something you mentioned.
You brought it up, to be clear.
Stan, you mentioned innovation and so forth, and Jim, you wrote a wonderful book that got mentioned, The Conservative Futurist, on technological development, on hindrances to it and so forth. And the Biden administration, they passed the Chips and Science Act of 2022, which intended to boost U.S. semiconductor manufacturing and kind of reduce our reliance on Taiwan. Can you kind of give us a brief overview of the Chips Act, but also, do you think it was an effective kind of technological R&D, or is it just something like corporate welfare? And would this give us an idea into what a Harris administration would look like as an approach to technology and technological development?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to run a really interesting experiment in what they call industrial policy, in which government picks particular technologies or companies or sectors to give support to. And that support could come in the form of, well, we were talking about tariffs, and come out with those kinds of trade preferences, or it can be a tax break, or it can be actually direct assistance, subsidies. And we've decided to try to subsidize domestic advanced chip making to the tune of about $40 or $50 billion, with the goal of having a greater percentage, which currently is zero, produced here domestically in the United States. And there are 3 companies that are getting money. There's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, TSMC, Samsung, and one American company, Intel. And they are building the most advanced chip foundries here in the United States. They're trying to, with the goal of taking that 0% number to, I think it's 20, I forget if it's 20 or 30%, but I think it's 20% by 2030. And we'll see if that works. I mean, the record of governments being able to do that successfully is not great. I think most economists are skeptical of this effort. I think the justification is twofold, that it's just, and the issues sort of resilience and supply chains really came to the forefront during the pandemic, but do we think it is a good idea for such a high percentage of this fundamental commodity for the modern economy to be made in one place next to a geopolitical, at best, competitor and in an earthquake zone? I hear that mentioned a lot. Or would it be better these chips were made other places? Now, they don't necessarily have to meet, you can meet those qualifications not having them made in the United States, but that is what we have chosen, and is the reason because of national security, is it resilience, is it to provide good jobs for Americans, especially good jobs perhaps in swing states, all of the above. But I will be very interested to see what percentage of chips are made here by decade's end. I mean, for people who are sort of old enough, this is like another go-around with the idea of having greater confidence in the ability of government to sort of accelerate particular industries. We saw this in the 1980s, where Democrats got very enthusiastic about what Japan was doing, and they said, wow, if Japan can pick certain companies and support certain sectors, and it seems to have worked out great for Japan, why aren't we doing it? Then Japan kind of went to a long economic slump, and that idea kind of faded away, and now it's sort of returned. I think primarily, the pandemic has played a role, but also you have people in both parties who look at China and like, wow, they seem to be able to, advance certain technologies. They throw a lot of money. If it can work for them, it can work for us. And also, gee, we can place all these plants in states, and those people will vote for us. So there's always, that sort of political angle. But yeah, it's a pretty bold, economic experiment.
Do you think this industrial policy, it's obviously kind of taken off, particularly among the right, but do you think this is just a thing that we're going to see on both sides as going forward? Just industrial policy is kind of the policy to get voters and so forth?
Yeah, I think right. I think back in the 80s, I think they were called Atari Democrats. It was really kind of a democratic thing. Here, there are elements on both sides. And I think people will continue to enthusiastically pursue it until we have to relearn that lesson.
The administration has done a lot of it, right? It's not just a thing on the...
And it's not a new thing. I mean, Biden didn't start doing it. I mean, it comes in waves in terms of
you call, like, in a way, sort of all of defense policy is a kind of industrial policy.
Right. I mean, a lot of our energy policy is industrial
all of
policy.
healthcare policy.
Healthcare policy, right? Yeah.
Well, Alex, I want to bring it back to you. You mentioned when you were going over the Tax Cuts and Job Act, you talked about the corporate tax rate. And something that Vice President Harris wants to do is raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, which is still lower than the 35% that it was at. But former President Trump wants to slash it down to 15%, apparently. What are the kind of economic consequences of corporate tax rates? And people tend to kind of think of corporations equals the rich or the wealthy or whatnot. But what are the actual outcomes of these very different proposals?
Sure. So just to go back for a second to the history that you alluded to. So for decades, the U.S. corporate tax rate was 35%, and the corporate tax rates around the world were falling steadily to some number in the low to mid 20s. And so there became this large gap opened up, and a large differential between how U.S. headquartered businesses were taxed on their worldwide income and what the tax burdens were of U.S. companies, multinational competitors, companies headquartered in other countries. And so that large disparity had a bunch of consequences. A bunch of U.S. companies started moving abroad, reincorporating abroad, and at any given moment, there were these competitive disadvantages for U.S. businesses. And so there was this long discussion, as I was mentioning earlier, like, we got to do something about this. We need to get the U.S. tax code to be more on par with the tax code of our major trading partners. And that's where we got this 21% rate in 2017. And then the question is like, is that the perfect number? Would it be better if it's lower? Would it be okay if it was higher? And so the Biden administration and the Harris campaign, think it would be fine if it was higher. They recognized that 35, created a lot of distortions, both vis-a-vis our companies and our trading partner countries' tax codes, and also there are other distortions that you get when you have a very high tax rate. And so there's a large incentive to use a lot of debt to finance your businesses relative to equity, and there are other distortions that are associated with high marginal corporate tax rates. There's also these fiscal pressures, and so like the Biden administration and the Harris campaign say like, well, every 1 point increase in the corporate tax rate brings us over $100 billion, $130 billion per decade, and we need the money. We need the money for this or for that or something like that. This kind of soak the rich kind of idea. And so they've advocated for this incremental increase in the rate. And then, as you said, former President Trump, first he talked about taking it to 20%. Now he's also talked about taking it to 15%. I mean, my view is that none of these things are happening. Particularly the rate's not going down. I don't know why the rate would go down.
Well, we'll go to 20 because it's a round number.
Well, that's true. I mean, he did say that was one of the reasons that he pitched this idea to the Business Roundtable, and he did strike that argument. I actually worked for a lawmaker who liked everything to end in a 5 or a 0. So these actually do drive outcomes.
He must have really found that 39.6% rate.
Yeah, that's right. Well, he took that rate to 35. But you haven't heard from the business community itself that they really need the rate to be 20 or really need to be 15. I'm not saying that they don't want it, and I'm not saying that they wouldn't offer some advantages. It would continue to reduce the distortions between debt and equity. It would lower the cost of capital. It could increase capital formation. It could be good for U.S. businesses. But we're not at a point where there's some strong groundswell of interest from the business community in getting that rate to an even number.
Or inversions happening or whatever.
Right, exactly. Some of these concerns that were happening. And rates around the world are pretty much the same as they were in 2017. So it's not like, a new crisis, a new relative comparison concern has arisen. And so that's kind of, and this would require an act of Congress, right? So unlike the provisions that are all set to expire at the end of next year, the corporate reforms are not set to expire. So that's baked into law. That's not going anywhere. You don't have to address that issue. You could, and so if Democrats sweep and they and have majority control in the House and the Senate, and they win the presidency, and they're looking for revenue, they could raise the corporate tax rate. I mean, they may. I mean, they may do it to 25. That may be their compromise. That would get them, $500 billion that they could then do something else with. But I think, that's probably a more likely scenario than the scenario where it goes, down 4 or 5 points.
Gotcha. Well, this last question I'm going to pitch to all three of you, and I'll start with Jim and kind of work the way down. So Vice President Harris talked about how she wanted to build an opportunity economy in the debate. And so in your view, what are the actual components of an opportunity economy, and how close does each major presidential candidate actually get to it based on the policies that they will likely pursue? So Jim, what are your thoughts?
This is already given my little 1980s industrial policy history lesson. The other lesson would be the 1990s, which we had a very fast-growing economy. Productivity growth, labor productivity growth was quite strong. Wage growth was quite strong, and it was strong across the income spectrum. And what's interesting is that it was also a period where you had rising inequality, but there were not sort of these anti-Wall Street demonstrations. There was not anti-Silicon Valley demonstrations, because it really was a period where a rising tide was pretty much lifting all boats. So I guess the lens which I would judge those policies would be, to what extent did these policies accelerate economic growth and productivity growth in a sustainable way? If we do that, and New York Times readers may be surprised because they've been told that this actually really kind of doesn't matter, but that if you have faster economic growth, people will do better. There'll be more opportunity. There'll be new jobs. Some jobs will disappear, but they'll be replaced by new jobs. What those jobs are, I don't know. The entrepreneurs have yet to create them. So I guess I would focus on, do these policies help with economic growth? Stan mentioned housing policy. I mean, that's more abundant housing. That's especially in sort of these high productivity regions. Like, I would call that a pro-growth policy. How each side what they would like to do about AI regulation. Maybe AI will not turn out to be an important technology. Maybe it'll turn out to be like, 3D printing, which people wrote a lot of articles about. And
Are you getting a little disappointed by the AI stuff?
no, just the opposite.
Okay.
Just the opposite. But maybe it won't turn out to be an important technology. But if it does, it could turn out to be a really important technology. So I think we need to be careful about how we regulate that. That did not come up at the debate. So that is sort of the lens I look at a lot of these policy proposals through, because I think economic growth is really important. And if we can do better than what the current forecasts are, which is about 2%, which is a lot less than what it's been since World War II, which is over 3%. That would make, if we can be 2.25 instead of 2, or 2.5 instead of 2, that all adds up over the course of time. So that's kind of how I look at it.
All right, Stan?
Well, Jim mentioned housing supply constraints, which I think I still agree that would be a good move. I said it 10 minutes ago. Stand by that. More broadly, I think the general push toward the free movement of people, capital, goods, services across the country or nationally. I think moving in that direction would be helpful for the two campaigns. Those ideas have not been super popular the last 10 years. So anytime I see anything that goes a little bit in that direction, whether it is loosening housing supply constraints that make domestic mobility a little easier, or not calling for worldwide 20% tariffs, I'm satisfied. I'm not demanding a hemispherical area of free movement.
A Reagan free trade zone?
No,
Reagan free trade and movement zone?
What is it? The North American free trade superhighway? Is that the thing that Lou Dobbs used to be worried about?
We
I'm
should
not
call
quite
it
demanding
the
that
Reagan.
kind of stuff, but the Reagan free trade zone. Is that the full America? Is that
As wide as possible.
wide as possible? Yeah.
Did you say Lou Dobbs?
Yeah.
Does anyone know who Lou Dobbs is? Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, a whole like
He used to be very concerned. I don't know if you know this. The North American superhighway. It was a highway. I don't know. Like,
It's not a real thing. Through North America.
Obviously, you can drive from like San Diego to Seattle, and then when you're in San Diego, you can also drive on to Mexico. And he was really worried about that. That was a big conspiracy. Anyway, but yeah. So moving a little bit toward the neoliberalism of the 1990s that now has been. Now is for some reason frowned upon, even though everything was awesome back then.
The 90s were awesome in all sorts of ways.
Anyway, so that's I would like to see a little bit more of that. Yeah.
I would just say that from the rhetoric of opportunity economy, I think I love that rhetoric. I just think that sounds really good. I don't actually know what that means, but I do like how it sounds.
And it's better than the opposite.
Exactly. But like I'm for that, particularly before you tell me what it means or what it is, because I think that it's like it does speak to sort of a core conservative perspective and a core American perspective about like the ability to do better in the future, right? And I think that Vice President Harris is really grasping on to that notion of helping people or allowing people or freeing people in some sense, to move up, and it follows along with some of the other rhetoric from the debate about looking forward, not back, and all this kind of stuff. And I think that can resonate with a lot of voters. But again, like the details is like, what does it mean? Does it mean select restrictions on international trade? Does it mean industrial policy where the government tells us which industries are cool or uncool? Does it mean these types of restrictive things? A targeted tax credit for this activity because they've decided that we should have more of that and less of this other thing. Like that doesn't seem like the kind of freedom opportunity that.
But that is usually what it means.
But yeah, I mean, right. But
like the rhetoric is good. Yeah.
Right. The rhetoric is good. But when they go to put that rhetoric in place, what we're going to see is they're going to be picking answers that they think are the right ones for us. And that could be industrial policy, but it could be in trade policy, it could be health policy, it could be other things like that, where they're deciding what the opportunities are going to be. And that's not exactly what opportunity economy would mean to me. In terms of former President Trump, I think it's kind of the same. I mean, he also can talk about opportunity. I mean, anyone can, right? No one owns that rhetoric. And then, he's also going to pick what do you think, what those policies are going to mean. And it's going to mean less trade and more of an isolationist economic agenda, which is inherently limiting those opportunities.
All right. Well, thank you very much for answering my questions. But now I want to open up the floor to. Oh my God. Let's go ahead. Let's start right here in the front with Adam here. Sorry, Olivia, make you trek all the way up there. Also, if you would, please give your name, where you're from, and state your question in the form of a question.
Hi, I'm Adam Lahodi from Columbia University. My question is, we've seen increased collaboration between OECD countries to try and clamp down on international tax avoidance, 15% minimum corporation tax. What do you think are going to be the economic impacts of this greater collaboration? Is it good or is it bad?
Well, so this process has been ongoing for a while now, and in theory, all of those countries have signed up to implementing basically a corporate minimum tax that applies to multinational corporations, and then there are certain ways to backstop moving income toward countries that do not participate in this global minimum tax. Basically, the countries that participate in the global minimum tax, they get the tax income that's moved toward countries that don't participate, and so the idea is that way everyone will participate. The implementation is not going as well, I think, as people had hoped. The US is not really implementing the scheme. And so what I am a little bit worried about is that it'll unravel. And I think the way it would probably unravel is that the concerns that led to this agreement in the first place, which are mostly European concerns about American tech firms who do a lot of business in Europe, but do not pay a lot of corporate tax in Europe because all of their intellectual property sits in America. They don't employ a lot of people in Europe because it's tech products. European countries are going to say, we're just going to impose special local taxes on you, digital service taxes, those kinds of things. Basically, effectively a tariff for the tech industry. And the US will retaliate against that in some sort of way. I think that's how it's going to unravel. It hasn't happened yet, and so maybe it won't, but especially if there's a broader trade conflict, it wouldn't surprise me if it goes completely off the rails. I'm not super optimistic about the implementation. I was surprised, actually, that the Biden administration pretty explicitly went in a different direction as opposed to trying to implement the program. Maybe next year with the TCJ the extension, they will try to do something, but I doubt it. It doesn't seem to be on the table at all. It sounds very ominous to some people to have a global minimum tax, so I think that doesn't help. A bit like your superhighway.
I mean, I would just add that there's a lot of bipartisan American concern about this, and so we see that on the congressional side, and so very little interest in participating and coordinating.
Though there is now, of course the U.S. now has all sorts of international corporate minimum taxes already on the books, right? So you'd think fit that into the scheme, but we're not doing that. Yeah.
All right, right over here.
Hi, I'm Jay Kirshen from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My question is for Mr. Brill. With tax policy going to be a big focus in this next Congress, what tax policies should be enacted to address our debt while maintaining and fostering economic growth? And is there a candidate that you think would be better at accomplishing this?
That's a great question. We do have a serious and rising fiscal debt challenge. We have tax revenues, scheduled into the future to be roughly flat, slightly increasing. If you allow for the expiration of the TCJA, revenues go up a little bit. Outlays are scheduled to go up a lot. It's primarily entitlement spending, Social Security, and Medicare, that's bad. Somehow we're going to need to address both the accumulated debt and the prospective future debt burdens that are in the projections. My view is that there is no single tax policy set of tax policy solutions that can solve that challenge. So there's absolutely the need for something on the outlay side, some reforms to our entitlement programs. I also believe that in the future, federal outlays are rightly going to be higher than they were in the past. And that's because we are an aging society. So we are sicker and older, and there are more obligations of the federal government to care for the sick and the old. And so we will need additional revenues in some sense. So this expiration of the TCJA creates this opportunity because it is so expensive to extend it. It will $4 trillion in additional debt if they extend it without any offsets. There's an opportunity to try to fill in that cost at least, right? There may be needs for additional revenue beyond that. What I would say is where can we get the more revenue? I'd just say there are lots of ideas. If you ask politicians, they'll say there are no ideas. They'll say if there were any loopholes that we could have closed, we closed them in 2017. There's nothing left to do other than destroy jobs by raising taxes. I don't think that that's true. I think that there is a lot more of the tax base that could be subject to tax. And so one obvious one would be the tax treatment of employer-provided health benefits. This is not an easy thing to do. They tried to do this and had to reverse themselves. But just in brief, when your employer pays you, you pay income tax on those dollars, the wages you receive. You do not pay income tax on the health insurance benefits that they provide you, and they deduct both the wages and the health insurance benefits. So the health benefits are excluded from the income tax. You could subject some of that benefit to income tax and raise an enormous amount of money. People would object, of course, but it's an example of the fact that there is a lot of income that is earned that is not subject to tax. So before we start sort of monkeying with the rates, we could monkey with the tax base. The other one and
we did the Affordable Care Act had, which is what you were referencing, right? Started doing that for the most expensive healthcare plans.
Exactly.
And then it never got implemented.
So it is not an easy thing to do, right? They tried and then had to ultimately undo that. The other one that I would just put on the table as a possible source of, let's say, $1 trillion in the next decade would be to impose an excise tax on carbon emissions. And so this is perhaps equally unpopular.
Is that your low-hanging fruit category?
Yeah,
the easy stuff done?
It's my low-hanging, I'm not in charge of anything fruit category. There's a lot of interest a lot of concern about climate policy, climate change rather, a lot of discussion about it in the Inflation Reduction Act. They went the opposite way. They increased subsidies, tax credits to encourage clean and renewable fuels. But I think it's an example of not picking winners and losers through an industrial policy, but addressing the concerns over carbon emissions would be to impose some modest excise tax on carbon, and that could generate significant amounts of revenue.
Yeah, I'll say that maybe the two biggest ideas on tax policy that have come out of this campaign so far would not broaden the tax base. They seem they would narrow the tax base, which is not taxing tips and not taxing overtime pay. And
remember, we're also going to exempt Social Security benefit. At least the Trump campaign wants to exempt Social Security benefit.
Right, and expanding the child tax credit to $3 $5,000 or $6,000 is
Those are trillions of dollars.
those are trillions of dollars in tax cuts.
The tariffs just got higher.
Yeah,
Pay for
so the chatter is going the wrong way. It's going the other way. Now, to be fair, the Biden administration and the Harris campaign have talked about offsetting the cost of some of their tax policies, and that's where you get like a billionaire's tax and the higher corporate tax rate that we talked about. Their policies are not broadening the base. They are generally should be.
And they're very constrained by the fact that they only want to raise revenue from the very highest earners. So they have pledged not to raise taxes on households that have an income below $400,000 a year, which is the overwhelming majority of the income spectrum, right? Which is, the way in which European governments raise a ton of revenue is by having high tax rates on the middle class and a high value-added tax on top of that. And that's no one in the U.S. is willing to do that. But that's where all the revenue comes from. You're just very constrained if you only want to raise taxes above, say, 20% on the top 3% of the income distribution, 5%.
So you're in favor of the tariffs because they
that's what it
are
is.
middle-class tax increases.
That's right. I like them to be applied to everything.
All right. Let's go back here.
Hi, my name is Thaddeus Burson. I'm from Cedarville University. So it seems that national security is often offered as a reason or the rationale behind increased tariffs on Chinese goods. Do you think tariffs are the right tool for dealing with these national security issues? And if not, what are some alternative policy options?
I think they're not. I don't think the experiment we've seen over the past 8 years, I don't think has brought really any national security benefits. If you look at the Trump administration imposed a bunch of tariffs on Chinese imports and then negotiated a trade deal just before the pandemic hit. The concessions the U.S. got in that trade deal was stuff like China is going to buy more soybeans and send more business travelers to the U.S. Those are not significant national security benefits. Right? So even on their own terms, it just didn't work.
And then they didn't buy the soybeans.
Yeah. So, there you go. Which is fine. Like if they don't want the soybeans, like I don't want them to buy the soybeans, like whatever. But so I think it's been super ineffective, and it's costly to both sides. Maybe it's more costly to them than to us. I don't know that that's obviously true. But so I think it's been. I think it's just there's both sides lose. I don't know that the future nuclear war ends better if we both started poorer. Like that seems to be the logic underlying a lot of this. I think you can have some restrictions on very sensitive technology, maybe, though that also then gets applied pretty broadly, pretty quickly. We now see the administration invoking national security rationales to oppose the acquisition of a U.S. steel manufacturer by a Japanese company. I read the logic being that the Japanese government would take off with our steel factory if the moment of conflict with China start. These things get applied so broadly, so quickly that I've become very skeptical of the rationales that are being offered. A couple of weeks before that, the Biden administration expressed concern that China was dumping critical minerals on us. Like they were sending us critical minerals too cheaply in an effort to undermine our national security. A lot of this just sounds like very, very weak, implausible cover for very traditional protectionist measures. And I think of the sort of set of measures we've seen, a very tiny subset has any sort of direct link to national security.
All right. Let's go with Ari here.
Thank you very much for your perspectives this morning. My name is Ari from Harvard. And my question is that Trump has made some claims threatening the independence of the Federal Reserve, fomenting anxiety among many corporates and economic students alike. And so my question is, do you think that these claims are more bark than bite, or do we have legitimate reason to worry?
I think we do have legitimate reasons to worry. I think some of his nominees in the first term were quite bad, bordering on the clownesque, right? You had Herman Cain, Steve Moore. Neither of those got confirmed. I think they would get confirmed now if there was a Republican Senate in its second Trump term. Maybe not, but it would be risky. Judy Shelton almost got there. It was like one vote away from getting confirmed after she lived in the Trump Hotel for like 486 days straight. And so I do think there's a risk that they'll be sort of political stooges. Of course, the Federal Reserve is also a political institution, subject to pressures. All the governors are appointed by the president. It's not completely insulated from politics as it is. I don't think it's a coincidence that after taking on a ton of debt and with a president who was very focused on full employment, we got 8% inflation. So I don't think it's a completely binary question, but I do think that in his first term, Trump already showed that he has a preference for, governors who are more willing to do his bidding and who are more in line with his preferences. I don't think he's very good at it. Like for example, we now have a Governor Waller, who's pretty hawkish, that he picked because Waller's boss, the president of the Kansas City Fed at the time, was very dovish in the FOMC meetings. And then Trump thought, oh, I want that guy, the Kansas City Fed president, because he's very dovish. And then that guy didn't want to do it. And so then they ended up with the research director at the Kansas City Fed, which was Waller at the time, who turned out to be the opposite. But Trump picked him because he associated him with his boss at the time. And so he's not been very effective at getting the Fed to do his bidding. But I mean, I do think it's a little bit concerning, especially, I think we've seen these shifts in the Fed's framework over the past, few years that make it seem like maybe a little bit adrift, right? We had the change to flexible average inflation targeting during the pandemic, which I think has not been a great success. In fact, I think the Fed is kind of explicitly repudiating it now because under their new framework, right, they're supposed to target an average of 2% inflation. We just had significantly elevated inflation, so you'd think now we do a few years of below 2% inflation. They're not going to do that, right? So they've already said basically, we don't really believe our new framework that was built for the 2010s, for the Great Recession. And so given that there's already a little bit of drift and what we saw from Trump in the first term, I do think there's reason for concern, especially just because of what he's announced. And I don't know, maybe Senate Republicans will hold firm again like they did in the first term, but you don't know. Yeah.
I just add, there's also the role of uncertainty in this question that just matters. Like, there's what he says, and then there's will he be able to deliver on that promise or rhetoric? Maybe not, but like in the meantime, we're elevating the amount of uncertainty around Fed policy, and I think that's.
I'm sorry for criticizing your close friend Steve Moore. It's fine.
Let's go back.
Hi, my name is Ethan Martin, and I'm from John Brown University. So there's a lot of talk about opportunity and choice, but what I'm concerned about, and I think a lot of people should be, is an economic downturn or recession. We saw in COVID that there was a bad recession. And then in Japanese market, we saw that a couple weeks ago or more than a month ago. Should we expect something like a 1920s type depression in coming years?
Well, I hope not.
With either of their policies, how likely is that to happen?
I don't think there's any reason to expect a 1920s style depression. I learned from Jim that the golden rule of financial punditry is to give either a number or a date, never both. And so I'm not going to give you any very specific.
There will be a recession at some point in the future.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
I mean, I think there's risk. I think so I think since sort of 2012, I think the recession, if we end up with a recession, it would be because of a monetary policy mistake, because the Fed keeps rates too high for too long. I think we're at risk of that because since 2012 or so, the Federal Reserve has been very committed to providing forward guidance where they tell us in advance what they think interest rates are going to be. They tell us we're going to stick to this path for a while. I think because of that, they commit to paths of interest rates that, obviously after the fact are not necessarily optimal, but because they tell us that that's what they're going to do, they stick to them for too long. I think that's what they did in 2021. I think we're at risk that it will turn out that that's what they will have done now again, that they will have stuck to a path of interest rates that's too high for too long, and we're going to end up in a recession. But, that could be a mild recession. They can just cut quickly, and then hopefully we'll bounce back. I'm sure next year, Alex's guys will come up with a tax plan that provides dramatic fiscal stimulus, and so that'll boost the economy a little bit too in the short run. And so I think you'll be okay.
Let's go right here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Sage from Harvard. James, I have a question for you. So earlier you said that in the 90s we had a very fast-growing economy. There was some increased inequality, but not the sort of anti-Wall Street, anti-tech demonstrations that we see today. I guess I'm curious if you don't really, it seemed like you were saying that wasn't the reason why there was, or is now, this very great inequality and kind of anger at companies in the country. I'm curious what you think is the reason for that.
Well, I think we had a massive financial crisis, a huge economic downturn in 2007, 2009, followed by a slow recovering economy where unemployment stayed quite high. I mean, that was a very difficult economic period. So I don't think it should be any surprise that people were frustrated. I think that's manifested itself in a number of ways, including probably the populist movement. I mean, I would love to see what our politics looks like if we went through a period of higher than expected economic growth, at least for a number of years. I think it would look a lot better. I think we get less of these sort of closed economy populist ideas like tariffs, keep out the immigrants. I mean, I think it matters. I think if you look at our country's history during times of rapid growth, you saw a kind of a more positive politics, a politics less concerned about who is taking something from us. You saw less of a zero-sum politics, and I think that's what we're in right now. So yeah, I mean, I've talked about the sort of the industrial policy experiment. I mean, the experiment I would really like to see is one where we have very rapid growth for a number of years. Easier said than done, but
we're getting there. We've been at full employment for like 2 years, and we're already seeing an Oasis reunion tour.
I mean, that's not an insignificant development.
The 90s are
I
back.
should have mentioned that initially.
All right, we'll do one more. Let's go right here.
Hi, Matthew James from Seton Hall University. I have a question on the kind of contradictory stance adopted by many Americans on the role of immigrants in low-skill, low-wage labor, where many don't only want to close the border to new people coming in, but also deport millions of people already in the country, while simultaneously wanting a strong labor force and economy that benefits from low-wage labor, filling important jobs in agriculture, but also in caregiving for our increasingly aging population. So what is the economic impact of that, especially under the immigration policy under Trump administration?
I mean, in certain industries, it would be a massive shock, right? If you take the campaign promise literally of deporting everyone without legal status, maybe except people. I mean, in some versions, they want to deport everyone with DACA, with TPS, with. Yeah, I mean, they would destroy the agriculture industry. It would be really devastating to millions of American households that have members who are undocumented, right? Including millions of American children born here who have an undocumented father or mother or both parents. I think that's the most direct impact. Then you have the caregiving industry, leisure hospitality. There's a bunch of industries that are super reliant on undocumented workers. It would be a big negative shock for those industries. What would it do? It would lead to businesses going under, other people at those businesses losing their jobs, people losing their businesses, customers, of course, not being able to get their services, their goods. Many of the elderly losing their caregivers, children.
I mean, to be fair, some immigration restrictions have I think, pretty persuasively addressed that. I think legitimate concern in which they've suggested that perhaps all college students, rather than working their fancy internships on Wall Street, maybe during the summer should go to the fields. They should go to the fields and help replace those immigrants.
Perked up.
I think
there's a historical precedent. We saw that in Cambodia, where they took the people from the cities and brought them to the fields. I think that, so I think they call that their Year Zero project. So I mean, there's things we can do. This looks like a very hale and hearty group.
I think Ben Sass wrote a book about this titled "The Vanishing American Adult" when he was a senator, and then he quit 2 jobs in a row prematurely. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we'll banish you all to the fields. So please join me in thanking our panelists today.